Well, here's the scenario. When Johnny or Joni can't read, when teachers get hamstrung by policies that they say stresses testing over teaching, when parents complain that their children aren't getting enough attention, and when principals are pulling their hair out over the lack of school resources. Well, all of those problems eventually end up at the doorsteps of school superintendents. That's where the buck stops, and that's where our show today begins. Hello everyone, welcome to 12 in Our Schools. I'm Brian Jenkins. Today we'll tackle some tough questions with school superintendents. They often end up as the heroes and the villains, depending on the state of affairs in their respective districts. We'll take a look today at the roles they actually play. Joining me today, Dr. Richard Baza, the Executive Director of the New Jersey Association of School Administrators and a former practicing superintendent himself. Also with us, Dr. Nathan Parker, Superintendent of the Summit Public School District. Thank you both for taking the time, coming down to join us. I want to set the tone by looking at what you guys actually do, because most people don't have an idea outside of, you know, the guy wears a suit, he sits in an office, he's talking on the phone, he either fires or hires the teachers and the principals. But what's the real scenario?
Well, Brian, the real scenario is that school superintendents, men and women throughout the state, are the chief education officers of their communities. In most communities, they actually run the biggest business in town, employ the most people. They have great responsibilities, and they're accountable to many people, their school board, to their students, to their parents, to their communities. And so they really are the chief education officer in operating a very complex system with a lot of demands. And they're responsible for moving education forward in their district. They're responsible for securing the resources, for hiring the teachers, for maintaining teachers, for professional development, for getting the kids on the bus and off the bus and feeding them, and on and on and on, the many complexities of the daily life of school.
A lot of competing interests as well. You're talking about what comes from the governor's office in terms of the money that you get, what comes from parents who say, well, you ought to be doing more for my kid. That's got to be tough to take home with you every day and night. Now, let me throw that to you, Doctor.
Well, it is tough, and I think that one of the challenges is establishing the priorities that we as the educational leaders have to take in the school community, because there are these competing interests. And I think that when we get started in a superintendency, one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing is looking at the culture, trying to understand what are the needs, what are the academic needs, what are the financial needs, what are the physical needs, how is parent involvement, and how do these things mesh, how's the governance system. So it is a complicated process, and it ends up being a lot of night meetings and a lot of weekend meetings, but a lot of connections with students and with teachers, with parents, and really community members and government officials, as you so well pointed out at the beginning.
Now, let me take it to some of the tough information that's coming out. You have the recent New Jersey School Report Card that kind of gives you a grade on what you've been doing over the year. This latest one says that 4th graders are actually improving, but 5th and 6th graders failing in droves on the proficiency test that they take. We have a quote from Steve Walmer, spokesman for the New Jersey Education Association. Let's throw that up. He says, the state is pushing too fast and hasn't created systems allowing teachers to share best practices with colleagues. We've had similar comments come from NJEA, primarily after the imposition of the No Child Left Behind, that they were focused on testing rather than teaching. You guys have to actually balance the two. How do you do that?
Well, we talk often about creating a community of practice, and in the case of standards aren't getting lower, they're getting higher every day, as they should, and identifying the correct standard. In some cases, we've had state assessments where they changed the bar after the test was taken, and some of the results that we're seeing report out the change in the bar, not so much the change in the performance of students. So one of the things that the chief education officer of every school district has to do is look at the data. What does it tell us? How do we then revise the things that we're doing, working with school districts? And in fact, we'd like to create a greater community of practice with the Department of Education. And I know how difficult it is for them with the resources not being there, even for the State Department of Education, and given the situation that we have throughout the state and the country. So we have to work with our constituents, we have to work with the teachers, we have to have the time that I think we hear from NJEA to look at the data, to speak collaboratively with one another, and to try to find the best ways to move forward. That's very hard to do, particularly as resources become more constrained.
Now,
go ahead. Let me just add a little bit to what Rich said, because I think it's a good judgment to look at what best practices are and try to disseminate those throughout the state. And the last position I was in, I was superintendent of schools in Orange. And Orange was one of the lower achieving districts in the state at 4th grade. About 50% of the students were scoring proficiency, and in 4 years, 80%. 2 out of the 10 schools were making AYP, and after 4 years, 8 out of the 10 were. Now, to me, that shows significant change over time. But how that change actually took place is something that could be copied and around the state, really, so that the person that you quoted previously, there's some value to saying what practices actually work and how can we transport those practices to other districts where they may not have that same kind of success.
Mm-hmm. You have a kind of a strange relationship between the younger teachers and older teachers in practices. And I hear the newer teachers coming in saying, well, this is a system that, you know, has practices that and policies that are 50 years old, 60 years old, and we've got to make changes. And yet those same teachers will say, well, administration's handcuffed us, we can't do anything. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that gets right back to the opportunity for professionals to talk to one another. We're in an age now where there's so much research coming out about how children learn, how adults learn. Recently I sat with some of my colleagues at a session where we talked about how children today process information in different parts of their brains than I as an adult or my parents did in doing the same task. So there's a lot out there from the science that we need to learn and how to modify the things that we do within the classroom, but that's where the issue of best practices, of communicating information, of continuing education and applying them in the classroom, and then saying, what are the standards for this century? They're not the same. Many critics say we're preparing great kids for 1960. And we need to look forward to what really should we be assessing in our children, in our students as they go to each level and as they leave high school, so that we know that they're well prepared for, frankly, a world where in my youth, we were talking about changing jobs. Now we're changing careers over the lifetime of our students as they enter this world.
Right. We're going to talk more about that in just a minute. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with Dr. Richard Baza and Dr. Nathan Parker to talk more about the role of superintendents in your kids' education. Stay with us.